So good afternoon, Dubai. My name is Mandi and I'm joining you from the Royal Veterinary College in London. A big thanks to David for providing some great technology to allow me to join you today at the Dubai International Horse Fair. I really wish I was able to travel there, but unfortunately it wasn't possible this week. So over the next 30 minutes, I'd really like to take you through some research both from my laboratory and other laboratories around the world that is looking at what makes a successful pregnancy. And this is successful not only in the maintenance of that pregnancy, but we also have to think about the long-term health of the fetus. All the work we do, I might be standing here today, but really involves a large number of people. So up front, I'd just like to declare all my collaborators, some great students, both past and present in the laboratory, veterinary surgeons we work closely with, stud farms here, and obviously all the funding bodies that permit our work to proceed. So what will I cover today? Well, I wanted to think about who is in my audience. What are you all sitting there thinking about? Why are you at the Dubai International Horse Fair? I thought I've probably got two groups of people here. One is breeders, so thinking about what is the best way to manage my breeding herd, what are the best reproductive technologies available, and then the other is probably people thinking about the performance of their animals. So for those horses that might be in racing or endurance, who's going to get across the line first and what's required to do that, optimal performance in the dressage arena or the show jumping arena. And really what I'd like you to take home today is that actually things that can influence these animals and their health and their viability and their performance are things that probably start even as early as the periconception period, even prior to conception, and thinking about the health of that mare. I'd like to take you through four things then to sort of think about this in a little bit more detail. And the first is to think about where are we at with breeding efficiency. So what's happened over past years in our ability to get these mares to conceive. So how easy is that? What sort of numbers should you be expecting in your operations? Then I'd also like to think about pregnancy loss. Most of the work done in my laboratory focus on the period of pregnancy, and we're particularly interested in what causes these pregnancies to fail. So I'll cover different causes of pregnancy loss and management factors that could modulate the risk of those pregnancies, so the do's and don'ts to take away. Then I'd like to finish up by introducing a concept called DOHAD, or Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. So this is thinking about what sort of programming of adult conditions, it might be, say, for example, you're interested in musculoskeletal health, that can occur during fetal life. And where are we at? There's a lot of work done in other species, but where are we at with the horse? So I thought just to try and get a broad picture here, I'd start by looking at reproductive efficiency over a long period, back from the 70s to present day. And this is looking at conceptions over this period using Weatherby's annual returns. And you can see over this very long period, there's been a steady improvement in conception rate, certainly in the thoroughbred. So over this time, though, if you look over the more recent period, sort of from the late 2000s to now, so over the 10 years, we seem to have sort of plateaued somewhat. So we need to start to have thinking about, have we already from a conception perspective, and I would think this is probably true, we've already sort of reached our maximum sort of abilities there. So what are these actual rates? These are a number of peer review studies where they've looked at different populations around the world, and you can see here more locally in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, their conception rates in this Arabian population was 53%. These vary in the full thoroughbred populations that fall underneath this from 54% up to 68%. These sorts of variations we see in conception rates are likely also to be influenced by the population of mares under study, with older mares generally having poorer conception than younger mares. But it should give you, nevertheless, like a ballpark figure of what you might be shooting for per cycle. The other data that we have available is having a think about the end of season pregnancy rate. So in the UK, where we're very seasonal, we will look at the end of that season and see what percentage of mares are pregnant. In other regions such as here, you probably have a lot less seasonal effects on your reproduction in your mares, so you might be able to think about this of sort of between up to 3 to 5 cycles, what sort of pregnancy rates do you achieve. And you can see here very similarly in both the thoroughbreds and the Arabians, you have quite high rates. Everyone's doing an amazing job actually, where about between sort of 80 and 90% of mares will be pregnant. So this then brings me on to, okay, they're getting pregnant, but I think probably one of the areas that we still need to do a lot of work is understanding why these pregnancies then subsequently fail. We've done a study recently looking at the incidence of pregnancy loss in a UK population of thoroughbred mares, and here's the data at the top here compared to a study done 11 years before that in a same sort of similar population of thoroughbreds. And what we've found here is that these pregnancies will fail most commonly in the embryonic period. So 67% of these pregnancies are going to fail between their initial examination by the vet at 14 to 16 days and 42 days of pregnancy. And it's not surprising, this is where we get all the organs in the fetus developing, and actually by 42 days we have what we'd call organogenesis, formation of organs is actually complete. And you can imagine these sorts of processes are high-risk processes that could go wrong, and if they do go wrong, that could lead to those embryos failing, amongst other reasons. We also noted that between 42 days and in the UK, the October scans, around 4 to 7 months, we have another just over 3% of pregnancies that will be lost. Quite interestingly, we broke this up into 2 periods. One was from 42 to 65 days, because I think this truly encompasses early pregnancy losses, not embryonic losses, but early pregnancy loss, a term we use in our laboratory these days, more common than the embryonic losses. And the reason we really wanted to focus on these as well is that in the horse, implantation is quite late. And so between 42 and 65 days, you have some really major physiological events occurring. So indeed, you're getting sort of all the major placental development occurring. They form what's called microcotyledons, little structures between the placenta and the uterus that ensure nutrition to be exchanged. And so this 65-day scan is really key at picking up any of the losses that are occurring associated with those processes. What's also interesting to note about this data is I think we've seen very little change in the rates of pregnancy loss over this period, not only in the early embryonic period, but also if we look at losses that are occurring between October, so 4 to 7 months, and term, with a rate of around 4.5% back in 2002 breeding season and 4.3 in 2013-14. And this is sort of a trend that we see around the world. There are lots of different there's a lot of regional variation in the causes of these losses in different regions, but I think this trend is sort of stays true. So let's look at those regions now. So you can see here embryonic loss rates across the UK, New Zealand, this is Japan and Ireland, and you can see that there's not a huge variation. They sit in between 5 and 9%. Interestingly, though, the losses that occur subsequent to that are a little bit more variable. New Zealand has very low rates of late embryonic loss, as shown in this study. This could be perhaps due to management strategies employed there, and it'd be really interesting to try and explore this and understand these differences. The higher rates experienced here in this particular study in the US are probably more reflective of the mare reproductive loss syndrome, which was an abortion outbreak around this time. So this gives you an idea of the figures, the numbers of pregnancy loss, but what's actually causing these pregnancies to fail. And this is where we start to delve into a lot of unknown ground. So the factors that influence early development can really be broken down into 3 areas. They can be broken down to factors influenced by the mare, which is not surprising, but in particular her uterine environment is going to be critical. So she needs the endometrial lining of the uterus needs to be healthy, it needs to be devoid of disease and infection, but also actually the general health of the mare is really important. So the fat composition in that mare is going to also influence early development. On the embryonic side, we also have the genetic composition of those embryos. remembering that the genes are inherited from the mare and the stallion, and therefore those combinations of genes are going to influence development. The placenta similarly will have genes, will be expressing genes from the mare and the stallion, and therefore its function could be influenced genetically there too. And then external to this actually is what I call environmental factors. So essentially this is like humidity, temperature, management procedures, so whether they're kept indoors or outdoors on fields, the pathogens in that region, so things like equine herpes virus that can cause abortion storms and pregnancy losses. There's a growing number of other pathogens around the world that can compromise pregnancies. Out in Australia recently, we've had a large number of cases of chlamydial infections associated with pregnancy loss. So all of these pathogens can sort of feed in. The diet we know is very important, not just giving sufficient feed, but actually too much feed could have differential effects too. And these horses these days are exposed to a number of therapeutics in pregnancy. Some of these might be part of general reproductive practice, but some of them may be required due to ill health during that pregnancy. We need to think about how they can influence development too. So they're the broad stroke factors that may influence the viability and the development of that fetus. But what really causes these pregnancies to fail? So what's the diagnosis? So if you're a veterinary surgeon, or you would find this if you go to your doctor as well, when it comes to pregnancy loss, that's an event or a condition. The pregnancy has failed, but it's actually not a diagnosis. What's actually caused that pregnancy to fail? And in many cases we've discovered we really don't know. And this is particularly apparent when we think about early pregnancy losses. So if you look at this image on the left of the screen here now, you can see here in about 80% of cases, there's actually no diagnosis as to the cause of that pregnancy to fail. About 10% of these pregnancies are associated with some sort of infection, and then about 10% are non-infectious. And by that I mean some sort of developmental defect that's picked up on ultrasound. If we look at mid to late pregnancy losses, the story is a little bit different. And there's two pieces of data I'd like to share with you in this regard. On the left here, this is a study published out of France, and this was looking at causes of pregnancy loss over a 24-year period, so quite a large period of time, a large number of pregnancy losses. And this is pregnancy losses that were submitted to a laboratory. And then they determined what the cause of those losses at the laboratory level were. And you can see here just under half of them, close to half, are actually associated with some sort of infectious cause of loss. So they've had some sort of infection that's led to compromise, the pregnancy being compromised. About a quarter have some sort of diagnosis, but it's non-infectious in origin, and about a quarter have no diagnosis at all. We have recently been working with a number of diagnostic labs in Newmarket and at the stud farm and veterinary practice level too, to try and understand this at a population level. And what we've actually found when we've looked at just over 2,000 pregnancies is about half of them are not investigated, so we have no idea what's going on in those cases. Half of them are investigated, and of those ones that are investigated, similarly to the French study, we find probably about 80% of those we do find out what's caused that loss. So if they are investigated, there's a reasonable chance that an outcome can be determined as to why that pregnancy failed. In the UK, at least, by far the most common cause for a pregnancy to be lost in these later phases is an umbilical cord torsion, with about 20% of these associated with an umbilical cord torsion, and grouped with that the pathologists what they call suspected cord torsion. So there are signs of that torsion, but they're not as definitive. What is an umbilical cord torsion? Well, essentially what happens then is the developing fetus, which sits inside what we call an amniotic sac. So in fluid, imbibed in fluid, it can actually like twist, and as it twists, it will start to cut off the blood supply that's coming through the umbilical cord, and therefore it's starved of oxygen and nutrition as well, and then that pregnancy will be aborted. We're not really sure what causes this torsion. It's very poorly described and studied in the horse, and hopefully over the next sort of 5 to 10 years we'll be able to make some progress in that regard. Interestingly, if you look in other regions of the world, the number of pregnancy losses attributed to torsions is lower. Whether they occur locally in these populations, I'd be really interested to hear from people in the audience. Other placental pathologies, which will include sort of infectious causes, have sort of less than about 10%, and then you've also got a small contribution of intrapartum stillbirths. If you look at other regions around the world, you have substantially more pregnancy losses associated with some sort of infectious cause. As I mentioned earlier, we've had outbreaks of chlamydia. We also get outbreaks of equine herpes virus that can lead to abortion storms. So I think one of the next things I'd like to talk to you about is trying to understand what's going on in this big grey area in the early pregnancy losses. So, because this is what became apparent when we started our studies 10 years ago, was actually that's a large number of cases where we had no idea what's going on. So we've been slowly trying to sort of work with clinicians, stud farms, to try and work out why this is the case. And the first thing we found was that we spoke to people, most people thought these pregnancies couldn't be obtained, and so we needed to develop a method to actually flush out the failed pregnancies. So we had tissue and genetic material to explore a diagnosis with. So here's a little method to give you an idea how these are obtained. Here's a pregnant mare here, and the veterinary surgeon will actually pop in a tube non-invasively through the cervix and flush out that pregnancy after there's signs that it's failed. So they'll have no heartbeat. There's no way that pregnancy will be maintained by that mare. So rather than it fall out the paddock, they'll actually remove it. And this has benefits as well because it cleans out the uterus and allows her to recycle much more quickly. Then this conceptus will be put in a special media which we've developed and optimized to allow it to be transported to the lab and not to degrade during that period. And then in the laboratory, these tissues are isolated from different parts of the placenta and the fetus. And we take some of these cells from these placental tissues and fetuses and culture them in the laboratory, letting us to do genetic studies. We also take some of the tissue and we freeze it, which allows us again to do some genetic studies. And then we fix the embryos in a fixative called paraformaldehyde. And essentially what we can do then is look for developmental sort of abnormalities. And we went into this, we started doing this in 2013, and since then we've been able to obtain about 50 of these failed pregnancies. So we're now at a stage where we can start to try and understand why they have failed. And there are a number of approaches that we're using, and I'll share one of them with you today, and that is trying to understand a potential genetic underpinning of these early pregnancy losses. We know from other species, in particularly in humans, for example, you're probably well familiar with the fact that as women get older, they have very high rates of aneuploidies. And what does that mean? So essentially, we have 2 copies of a chromosome, and so as women age, the embryos that they produce will tend to have, at times, an extra copy of a chromosome or a loss of one of those chromosomes. And these sorts of genetic abnormalities are associated with either a high rate of pregnancy loss or some sort of major sort of developmental condition in the offspring. And because of the expanding use of IVF programs around the world, we've also learned recently that as women age, these rates can go as high as like 90% of the embryos will have some sort of aneuploidy. No one really knows about whether these sorts of gross changes in the chromosomes can occur in the horse. And so the material we've collected over the last sort of 5 years has been quite rich in being able to provide us with somewhat of an answer in that regard, where we've looked at the prevalence of these aneuploidies, and in the ones that we've looked at so far, we've been unable to detect any aneuploidies. So whilst we can't rule out the presence of aneuploidies as a cause of pregnancy loss in the horse, we can say at this point that it doesn't appear to be overly common, but further tests will be done. So this would be an example, the aneuploidies were an example of what we would think of as a spontaneous genetic abnormality. So here you can see on the bottom left of the screen now, you can see 2 horses and a foal. And these sorts of abnormalities can occur in the embryo spontaneously during very early development. But there are a number of other genetic conditions that can also occur. You can have pre-existing genetic conditions in the mare, and these will then be inherited by the embryo, and these are generally associated with embryonic failure. These are particularly prevalent in mares that have recurrent pregnancy loss. So when they've lost multiple pregnancies, the veterinary surgeon will investigate that, and then some sort of genetic defect may be discovered. Pre-existing genetic conditions could also arise in the stallion as well, and they're often obviously taken out of the breeding pool. The other thing we need to think about when it comes to genetics is compatibility. So many of you anecdotally probably are aware of the fact that if you have a mare stallion who are bred, you may have a mare that's suffering pregnancy loss regularly with that stallion, but if you switch stallions, that loss won't occur. So this would suggest also there may be a level of genetic compatibility in mating as well. And we're currently looking at a large number of breeding records and pedigrees and doing some sequencing to try and develop a test so we could actually consider this compatibility in our matings. The other aspect of our work that we identified when we were looking for aneuploidies is we found that even though we couldn't find these aneuploidies, these whole chromosomes that were replicated in the horses in the embryos that had failed, what we did find is small regions of the chromosome that were either replicated or lost. So if you look on the bottom right of the screen now, you can see a region of the chromosome that's replicated, and similarly you can get losses, complete loss of those regions. This is what we call copy number variation. And it's quite possible that these could explain some of these losses. And indeed, a couple of the cases that we have appear to be male conceptuses that have regions of the X chromosome that are lost. And while we can't definitively say that's what caused the loss, it's a very good chance that is the case. So they're sort of looking at the causes, but the other way in the meantime, beyond trying to develop tests and diagnostic tests to understand the cause of the loss, is thinking about how we can modify risks of pregnancy loss. And so we've had concurrent studies going on, which are epidemiological in basis, so looking at large numbers of breeding records of mares. These were thoroughbred mares, and we had sort of 2,250 pregnancies here. And we looked at 23 different possible factors that could influence the risk of early pregnancy loss. And this is a bit of a summary of those findings. You'll see that we've looked at factors inherent to the mare, factors inherent to the embryo, and those external factors I talked about earlier, which could be the drugs they received, for example. And interestingly, out of 25 different factors that we looked at, 23 different factors we looked at, there were only actually 5 that seemed to influence the risk of pregnancy loss, either by positively or negatively influencing risk. The biggest one, I think, probably to think about is mare age, and this has been shown before, but essentially as the mare's age, her risk of pregnancy loss increases, and the odds of this per mare year is 1.1. So if you amplify this up over sort of 10 to 15 years, this can be quite an increase in odds. The other thing was thinking about endometrial health, and in particularly endometrial cysts increase the odds of an embryo being lost. So you can imagine inside the uterus is the endometrial lining, and in that endometrial lining, mares can suffer from what we call cysts. So these are like little regions of the endometrium that have this disease, cystic formation. And the cysts themselves could affect the ability of the embryos to implant, but they also might reflect a general deterioration of the uterus, just pointing out to us how important that uterine environment really is in the early phases of pregnancy. The other thing we found was the mares, as soon as it had just one foal, the risk of pregnancy loss increased by 2.5-fold. So it's quite a substantial effect after having just one foal. The positive things that we found were related to the size of the embryo. So we found that as the embryo got bigger, the odds of it being lost substantially reduced. And then of all the therapeutics that are used in routine reproductive practice, we found most of them had no negative or positive effect, which is really encouraging because they're actually not used to maintain or influence the pregnancy loss. They're actually used to help make an efficient stud farm. and they didn't appear to have any impact on the pregnancy. What we did find was that drugs that are used to induce ovulation, so these are drugs that you give such as Corinon and Ovuplan, they're drugs that cause a surge in hormones that leads to the ovulation, and we found that they reduce the chance of pregnancy being lost. So they seem to have a positive effect, and we need to explore the possible mechanisms, whether this is a direct association or an indirect effect now. As I said, mare age, I wanted to point this out again because what was interesting is we found the effect of mare age kicking in relatively young. So you can see there's a real jump from the 5 to 10-year-old mares in the rates of early pregnancy loss to those that are aged 11 to 19. So these sorts of effects that we're actually seeing not in really old mares, but in real middle-aged mares as well. So just to finish up the last couple of minutes, I thought I would like to introduce you to the concept of DOHAD, so developmental origins of health and disease, because this is really a really big area in reproductive biology at the moment in all species, and it's an expanding area in the horse. And I think it's something we really need to think about in the context of how we manage pregnant mares, what sort of interventions we use, and thinking about how they may have long-term influences on that offspring's health. So that horse that's down on the track and performing, what sort of early life events are going to influence that performance and its health. This is a review done by Pascal Chabat-Palmer, so she's a researcher based out of Paris and does a lot of work on DOHAD. And this really summarizes what we know from a large number of species, and a lot of epidemiological studies in humans have really backed up many of these observations. And what we find is maternal conditions or the maternal state, be it whether that mother has diabetes, obesity, the nutrition she's received, both under and over nutrition during pregnancy, that placenta's function, all of these actually can program the fetus to have certain outcomes in adulthood. So essentially they're exposed as a fetus to these different conditions, but then you can see some sort of outcome, whether it be an effect on bone development or cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes. The diabetes is less relevant to the horse, but metabolic disease is relevant. So all these things are outcomes in adulthood which could be derived or certainly influenced by this early period. So what do we know about this DOHAD and breeding mares? Well, we're at relatively early stages. The more recent studies have actually focused on more subtle things like nutrition and obesity at the time of conception, and how they might modify a number of conditions such as cardiovascular health, energy homeostasis, growth. And what seems to be the trend is many of these things that occur during exposures during pregnancy, not all of them, but many of them don't actually affect, sort of, say, the weight of the offspring, so of that newborn foal, but they can affect a number of other things. So for example, there's been a very elegant study done by Pascal Chabat-Palmer's group, which was published just this year, and what they found is a mare that was obese at the time of conception, so a time of insemination. She was compared to mares that were not. They were the same body weight on average, but their body condition scores were different. So there was a lot more fat deposition in the obese mares. And this fat deposition was associated with those foals that were born having a different metabolic state. They also had an increased chance of developing a condition called osteochondrosis dissecans, so lesions in the cartilage. And these were a lot more prevalent in the foals that were offspring of obese mares. This is independent of nutrition. There's also been a number of studies that looked at nutrition, and both in the mare and actually in the foal during early life, and how this can affect bone development. But actually this is obesity prior to even conception. That's important. And it's really interesting to see these possible effects on the offspring. We don't know yet what those effects are beyond sort of 18 to 24 months, which is the period of time that these studies have been carried out. But it certainly reminds us that we need to think about these factors. So along these lines of thinking about DOHAD and how it may affect the mare, we've been looking at some of our data in early pregnancy as well. And these are some measurements taken of the conceptus in early pregnancy between days 10 and 35 of pregnancy. And these were compared to look at the size in maintained versus pregnancy loss, mares that sustained a pregnancy loss. And you can see there is a difference as expected. This has been shown before. So the smaller pregnancies are the ones more likely to be lost. But independent of that, if you're focusing on the blue dots, there's huge variation in the size of these conceptuses. So we're now trying to ask questions around, well, what are the long-term effects that could arise from having these small conceptuses? They're not lost, but actually maybe there's another reason why they could have some sort of other sort of effects on offspring. Neonatal outcomes, bone growth, cardiovascular disease. So just to finish up, the take-home messages, well, I think we've found that although over a longer period of time, over 40 years, we've seen significant increases and improvements in conception rates, over the last 12 years or so, we're starting to see a lot more flatlining of those parameters. And it really begs the question, we really need to be using sort of consistent software, data analysis, and working together with all the stakeholders to monitor and analyse our reproductive performance and continually be vigilant in thinking about what could affect it. This brings in the value of this big data, and I think really to do some of the studies looking at the effects of fetal exposures on long-term health is going to require a lot of imagination and a lot of people coming together to bring big data together. And that's what they've done in human studies to try and understand these small risks, because that's where we're at. We've probably identified most of the big risks and we've got the small risks to work on. Few diagnoses are made on the cause of pregnancy loss in the mare, but we now have these new methods available to investigate this. So on the horizon, hopefully will be some new genetic tests to diagnose genetic causes of pregnancy loss. And DOHA does exist in the horse, and there is an evidence that could affect on a number of body systems, and we need to really start to think about this more thoroughly. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please do email me at this address. Have a good afternoon.